In 1899, Britain sent 450,000 soldiers to crush a farmers' republic of less than 500,000 people. Officially, it was about voting rights. Unofficially, it was about something buried under a ridge in the Transvaal, the richest gold deposit the world had ever found. By the time it was over, tens of thousands were dead, and Britain owned the gold. But to understand how a fight over ballots turned into one of the bloodiest wars the empire ever fought, you have to go back 13 years earlier, to the day one broken rock changed everything. Let's go back to 1886. A prospector named George Harrison cracks open a rock on a farm outside modern-day Johannesburg. It's part of a ridge called the Witwatersrand, a ridge of white waters. He has no idea he just found the largest gold reef on Earth. He sells his claim for about £10 and disappears from history completely. Within months, fortune seekers flood into the Transvaal. A tented camp near the reef swells into a city. They call it Johannesburg. Within a decade, it's bigger than Cape Town, a city that had ruled southern Africa for 2 centuries. But this isn't a gold rush like California or the Klondike. You couldn't just grab a pan and strike it rich. This gold sat buried in hard rock, thousands of feet down. Getting it out took industrial machinery, chemical processing, and thousands of laborers. It took capital most people on Earth simply didn't have. That's where Cecil Rhodes comes in, and where this stops being a story about gold and starts being a story about who controls it. Rhodes arrived in South Africa in 1870, a sickly 17-year-old sent by his family to recover his health. He ended up at the diamond fields of Kimberley instead. There, he figured out something the other prospectors hadn't. The real money wasn't in digging. It was in controlling who got to dig, and on what terms. Rhodes started small, renting out water pumps, buying up failing claims. By 1888, he'd built De Beers Consolidated Mines. Within a few years, De Beers controlled around 90% of the world's rough diamond supply. Then the Witwatersrand changed everything. Word of the gold spread fast. It pulled tens of thousands of foreign workers into the Transvaal, mostly British. They were called Uitlanders, outsiders. In parts of the Transvaal, they actually outnumbered the Boers themselves. And they wanted what British subjects everywhere expected: political representation, property protections, a government that worked with the mining industry instead of against it. President Paul Kruger wasn't having it. Kruger was devout, stubborn, and fiercely protective of Boer independence. He saw the Uitlanders not as future citizens, but as a threat to his republic's survival. He denied them the vote. He taxed the mining industry hard. He handed out monopoly contracts on essentials like dynamite to politically connected allies, driving up costs for every mine owner in the territory. For Kruger, the gold was fuel for Boer independence. For the men running the mines, the landlords, as they came to be called, Kruger's government was the one thing standing between them and a fortune. So Rhodes made a move, and it was about to blow up in his face. By the mid-1890s, Rhodes was Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, and he'd grown impatient. He organized an armed raid into the Transvaal. Time to trigger an Uitlander uprising in Johannesburg. Topple Kruger's government in the chaos, and British interests could step into the vacuum. He put his friend, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, in charge. On December 29, 1895, Jameson crossed the border with roughly 500 men. It fell apart almost immediately. The uprising never happened. Transvaal intelligence had been tracking the raiders from the moment they crossed in. Within 4 days, Jameson's men were surrounded and forced to surrender. The Jameson Raid was a disaster. Rhodes was forced to resign as Prime Minister. But the real damage went far beyond his career. Kruger now had proof, actual proof, that British officials had been plotting to overthrow him. He responded by arming his republic with modern artillery from Germany and France, and by expanding his army. The Orange Free State, neutral until now, allied firmly with the Transvaal. Then came the man who would make sure this crisis never actually went away. Alfred Milner was appointed British High Commissioner for South Africa in 1897. He believed British supremacy in the region was non-negotiable, and historians agree the record shows he was willing to manufacture a crisis to get it. In late 1898, after Kruger won re-election with a strong mandate, Milner met with the Colonial Secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, back in London. Kruger's government wasn't going to submit voluntarily. Gold had given the Republic the money to keep resisting British pressure. Milner told Chamberlain plainly, a crisis would have to be engineered. That's not a paraphrase, it's documented, close to his own words. The Uitlander grievances were the pretext. The real goal was bringing the Transvaal's gold under British control. In May 1899, Milner and Kruger met at the Bloemfontein Conference. Milner demanded full citizenship rights for Uitlanders within 5 years. Kruger, sensing a trap, offered to cut it to 7 anyway. Milner wasn't interested. He'd already decided only a war would get him what he wanted. He walked out of the conference. According to multiple accounts, Kruger wept afterward, saying it was his country they were really after. He was right. On October 11th, 1899, after Britain refused to withdraw troops from the Transvaal's border, the Boer republics declared war. Nobody in London expected what came next. It did not go the way Britain expected. The Boers were superb marksmen, expert horsemen, and they knew the land. In December 1899, a stretch the British press called Black Week, British forces suffered 3 humiliating defeats in a matter of days. The world's most powerful military was being outfought by farmers. Britain answered with overwhelming numbers, pouring in 450,000 troops, the largest deployment the Empire had made since Napoleon. By mid-1900, Pretoria had fallen. Johannesburg was occupied. The conventional war looked finished, but the Boers didn't surrender. They switched to guerrilla warfare, hit and run raids on British supply lines, then vanishing back into the landscape. And this is where the war turned genuinely ugly. In June 1900, British commander Lord Roberts launched a scorched earth campaign against the guerrillas. Soldiers burned Boer farmsteads to the ground, slaughtered livestock, and poisoned wells. The goal: starve the guerrillas of support. It left tens of thousands of Boer women, children, and elderly men homeless, with nowhere to go. Roberts began rounding those families into what were first called refugee camps. When Lord Kitchener took command that November, he expanded the burning dramatically and systematized the camps into a full network. History remembers them by their real name, concentration camps. More than 40 camps were built for Boer civilians. Roughly 60 more held black Africans displaced by the fighting. They were overcrowded, filthy, and desperately short of food and medicine. Measles, typhoid, dysentery. The diseases spread like fire through dry grass. By the time the camps closed, historians estimate more than 26,000 Boer women and children had died inside them. Some estimates run as high as 28,000. Roughly 80% were under 16 years old. The death toll among black African prisoners is harder to pin down, largely because British record keeping in those camps was far thinner. Estimates run from 14,000 to over 20,000. It was a British woman, Emily Hobhouse, who exposed what was happening. She traveled to South Africa in January 1901 and documented the starvation rations, the overcrowding, the dying children. Her report caused an uproar back home. Opposition leader Henry Campbell, Bannerman, called the camp's methods of barbarism in Parliament. Alfred Milner, the man who'd argued for engineering this crisis in the first place, dismissed her as a troublemaker. The war finally ended, but the way it ended tells you everything about what it was really for. The war ended May 31st, 1902, with the Treaty of Vereeniging. The Boer republics surrendered their independence. And here's the detail that tells you what this war was really fought for. Within weeks of the treaty, the reconstituted Chamber of Mines had the Witwatersrand gold operations running again. The machinery of extraction didn't wait for reconstruction. It came first. 28,000 dead women and children by the higher estimates. Roughly 7,000 Boer fighters killed. 22,000 British soldiers buried in South African soil. Uncounted thousands of black Africans dead in camps history barely remembers. And almost as soon as the peace was signed, the shafts were open again. Milner stayed on to govern the conquered territories. He restructured mining law in the industry's favor and scrapped the old dynamite monopoly that had infuriated the landlords. To keep the mines staffed, his administration brought in more than 60,000 indentured laborers from China between 1904 and 1907. They were confined to labor compounds. They were paid a fraction of white workers' wages. Many contemporaries called the conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. Rhodes never lived to see any of it. He died on March 26, 1902, 2 months before the treaty, at just 48 years old. His fortune went on to fund the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, a program that still exists today, attached to a legacy that remains one of the most contested in the history of the British Empire. Kruger died in exile in Switzerland in 1904. He never set foot in the republic he'd spent his life defending. And the gold they fought and died over, it's still coming out of the ground to this day. The Witwatersrand Basin has now been mined for nearly 140 years. It's produced close to 40% of all the gold ever mined in human history. South Africa's currency is literally named after the ridge, the Rand. Johannesburg, a city that didn't exist before 1886, is now the financial capital of the continent. So the next time someone tells you the Boer War was fought over voting rights, remember the timeline. Remember that the man who engineered the crisis said so himself in writing to his own government. Remember the 26,000 graves, most of them small. And remember how fast the shafts reopened once the guns fell silent. The gold is still down there. The question this war forces you to ask is the same one that echoes through every resource war since. Who actually benefits when the ground gives up its wealth, and who pays the price when someone decides it's worth more than the people standing on top of it? If this kind of story is one you want more of, subscribing helps a lot. I'll see you in the next one.